Welcome. Thanks, Lance. To day 2 of the COPAC 20th Anniversary Conference. This is the plenary panel this morning on the climate crisis. The climate crisis is worsening. What next for climate justice activism and internationalism? We have an outstanding panel. I'm going to do their bios very quickly up front, and then I'm going to have them speak without interrupting in between, and then we'll take questions at the end. I'm giving a maximum of 15 minutes each, so to leave plenty of time for our discussion. So David is a consultant at CARES and an ecological activist. He has participated in the RLS. Not sure what RLS is, but maybe he'll tell us. The RLS activities are COP23 and COP24. David is also a political activist and national committee member of Resistance and Alternative Extra-Parliamentary Eco-Socialist Party of Mauritius. So welcome all the way from Mauritius, David. We have Makoma, who is the director of Earthlife Africa, a civil society environmental justice and anti-nuclear organization. She has been active in social movements tackling issues of gender and women's rights issues, economic and environmental justice issues. In recent years, she's focused in targeting environmental corruption. Her commitment to climate justice in South Africa has led civil society to win the first South African climate change legal case against the government and the reversal of the nuclear deal by the South African and Russian governments, of which she received the Goldman Environmental Prize for Africa in 2018 and the Nick Steele Memorial Environmentalist of the Year. So that was a great victory. We all watched it and were very excited. Then we have Vanessa, who is an architect by training, but did not do architecture for long and followed her passion as an environmental justice activist. So she joined Earthlife Africa as a student in 1989, and after graduating, she became the Gauteng coordinator of the Environmental Justice Networking Forum. In 1993, Vanessa and other members of Earthlife Johannesburg conceptualized the Greenhouse People's Environmental Center project. Vanessa is coordinator of the project from 1997 to 2003 to facilitate its development from an idea to a functioning sustainable living demonstration and environmental center in Joburg Park in Johannesburg in the city. If you haven't been there, it's a fantastic space, and I highly, highly recommend you go there. And if you want to see a functioning, I don't know what the toilet's called, but it's an eco toilet. Oh. A composting toilet, and it doesn't smell, and it's in a house. It's really quite astounding. So it's an amazing space. I try to take my students there every year. In 2004, she relocated to eThekwini, working with various initiatives, including the African Center for Biodiversity, South African Urban Community Environmental Alliance, the Institute for Zero Waste in Africa, Young Insights and Planning and Agricultural Management Unit of eThekwini local government, and in 2015-16 she began contributing to information materials at BioWatch South Africa, and formally joined the staff in February 2017 as the Advocacy and Research Coordinator. She has a long list of commitment to the environmental justice movement. Then we have Vish. Vish is a democratic eco-socialist, and I'd add aspiring feminist, and has been an activist for over 3 decades. He is an associate professor of international relations at Wits and edits the Democratic Marxism series, and is a principal investigator of the Emancipatory Futures Studies in the Anthropocene Project. So as you can see, we have a wonderful panel this morning, but I will still be strict and not intimidated. Okay, so please start, David. Oh, and where are they? The people. Where? Yeah. Right there? Yep. Okay. Yeah? Yeah. Okay. Oh, so it's not a slideshow.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So I'm David. I'm representing CARES, which is an NGO from Mauritius. So it's the Center for Alternative Research and Studies. A warm thanks for inviting us. A warm thanks to COPAC for inviting us. It's my first time in South Africa, and I'm very glad to be in such events. Yes, so I'm a political activist in a party called Résistance et Alternative. We are eco-socialist. We are not yet in parliament, but we are having a lot of struggles in Mauritius concerning social issues and environmental issues, like beach grabbing, disruption of the environment. CARES is an NGO who is empowering movement, grassroots movements. In the past, we had campaign, for example, I will give you a few examples. For example, a campaign called Power Shift. So it has been a struggle against a fossil fuel central in Mauritius, and to put into the agenda agro-solar farms in Mauritius using cooperatives. It leads to a national audit public commission, energy commission in Mauritius. But then the government in power changed the laws so that such cooperative cannot enter into the energy agenda of Mauritius. CARES also empower movements related to the beach grabbing issues, which is a big issue in Mauritius. All the coastline is affected by local capitalists and also international capitalists who come to take the land and build luxury villas, big hotels that we don't need in Mauritius. We are also challenging on more social issues the constitution, the electoral process, because in Mauritius, when you want to participate to an election, you cannot do this as a Mauritian, as a citizen of Mauritius. In fact, you need to declare your ethnies, and such. So we are struggling against that, so that a citizen of Mauritius can participate to an election. So I will try to add a few points concerning what's our common understanding, and maybe it will also address something we talked about yesterday. My presentation will be very pragmatic, so maybe as a second step we'll talk about what is our political demands, and then how do we challenge the system using mobilization or using the legal system. And then we need to experiment alternative systems, and how to do this in the region. That's the internationalism part, and a pragmatic way of doing it is doing it in the region. I will show you a few examples. So it's interesting when we talk about climate crisis, and in fact I think I got some issues with the term climate crisis, because I think it's important to talk about the Earth system processes crisis. So I don't know if you know a bit about planet boundaries, but climate change is just one Earth system process in crisis, but there are others. For example, the biodiversity loss crisis. And of course, we need to choose a term, and it's climate crisis and climate justice that has been maybe chosen by default, but we would need to take care about this. So, there are about, I listed the current maybe 9 Earth system process. There are more, but missing scientific data. And for example, in Mauritius, we also have biodiversity loss crisis, freshwater use crisis. For example, in a little island near Mauritius, which is called Rodrigues Island, because deforestation is related to freshwater use, but also ocean acidification. Mauritius got a lot of ZEE, so economic exclusive zone. Mauritius has been threatened by monoculture, by sugarcane. So all the nitrogen cycle, phosphorus cycle is an issue in Mauritius. So I think what the aim of this slide is that we zoom out in regards to climate to get the big picture, which is the Earth system processes crisis. So maybe I would like that we call it the Earth crisis, and I like this because Earth is our connection. It can lead to Mother Earth. It's also related to our way of life, or the way the economic is disconnected from Earth. And here comes the planet boundaries. The proposal here is to integrate planet boundaries to eco-socialism. So, in the past, we defined the social limit. That's socialism. So, if you want to have an activity, you need to be above the social limits, which is wages, which is welfare from a social point of view of workers. And the new thing here is the ecological limit, and that human activities should be below some defined set of ecological limit. So that's related to the term planet boundaries, and each Earth system process as a tipping point we shall not cross. So the idea is to make it real, so that human activities keep below this ecological limit, below those tipping points. And I think this is very interesting. I don't know if maybe some of you could raise your hand if you already have this view of human activities below the ecological limit and above the social limit. Is it something you already think about? Could you raise your hand if you already think about this? Okay, great. Greta. Yeah, so this I think it's that one way of pushing the concept and making it becomes true with some concrete proposal and political demands. In regards to our common understanding, I just talked about climate, and I introduced maybe Earth, and now there's justice. And it's important to think about what is our common experience of justice. I will talk just about Mauritius. So there has been a Truth and Justice Commission in Mauritius related to slavery and indentured servitude in Mauritius. But we had a few reports, but then nothing has been done regarding to slavery and indentured laborers. So this is our experience of a justice process that did not give proper solution and address issues properly. So when we will talk about climate justice, maybe we need to think of in the past about justice we try to address. So currently, the question is how can we face future injustice when injustice of the past has not been properly and collectively addressed? Because here in Mauritius we have right to housing issues, food sovereignty, gentrification, and all of this is kind of a double penalty for the people. So now, how do we cross the river? So it's about to craft our political demands, and maybe each group, each movement should have its proper local solution. But in Mauritius, we have something called environmentally sensitive areas, which is related to the environment, to sand dunes, reef, wetlands, forests, cave, and we want to protect them in the law. Also ban the unique usage plastic, limit the human activities toward planet boundaries and above social limit. Also declare the Indian Ocean as a biodiversity reserve. Of course, traditional fishermen can continue to interact with the ocean, and they would take the role of the protectors of this ecosystem. We also want Indian Ocean as a zone of peace. In the very past, Indian Ocean has been declared as a zone of peace by the UN. I think it was in 1971. And then we want nature rights in our constitution. So this is our political demands. So it's real, and we need to fight for this. Once we got our clear demands, now we can talk about mobilizing people for something. So in Mauritius, for example, here it's the picture here. We are breaking walls. It's related to the coast, and it's a big hotel project in the coastline. It's also mobilization against fishing agreements. So the yellow tuna can disappear if the North continue to fish a bad way in our ocean. Here it's an hotel in Mauritius, and they just want to put the hotel in a wetland, which is amongst the best, the very valuable wetland in Mauritius. Here is all our brief, because we also challenge the system using the legal existing system. Concerning experiment alternative, I won't go into the details, but I just listed a few notions. I think emancipation, autodetermination, and what we call mind decolonization, which is the issues, the concept issues we have in our mind regarding patriarchy, capitalism, individualism, but we need to address. So how do we do this in an international fashion? For example, this resort in Mauritius, but the investors are from South Africa. So we could struggle together, because the investors is in your country, and the disruption is happening in our country. And here in Mauritius, we wrote Pelengri equal apartheid, because they see this beach as their private property. And another example, it's, I don't know if you know about the Mauritius leaks, but we had an offshore center, and our offshore center is harmful to the people of Africa. So we could fight with you. For example, there's issues with Angola, Kenya, and to help concerning this. Thank you.
Clearly, it's a bit intimidating. Okay, I'm just trying to get this off the screen. Just close
Good morning, everyone, and thanks very much for inviting us to be part of this summit. My name is Makoma, Lekalakala, as I was introduced, and from an organization called Life Africa, Johannesburg, and I'm glad that I'm joined by Vanessa, who's actually got much more info, and some of us were inspired by them, including Itmeleni, who is also going to be part of the panel of speakers later. I don't think I have to explain the extent of the climate crisis that we have. In this room, I know that we have people that we cannot preach to the converted, but what I'm going to try to do is to do some sort of a reflection, and particularly based on some of the discussions that have been taking place and also what has been written about. Coming from Life, it's an environmental justice organization, like I said, and our belief is that there's a need for a fair distribution of advantages within society, regardless of your background and your status. And some of these issues that touch on to that is access to clean water, for an example, food security, for an example, clean air, adequate and just infrastructure. And we know that infrastructure is a problem, particularly with the kind of natural disasters that we're facing. We know that what happened in Durban, besides that there's a natural disaster, it tells us that there was no projected planning in case this kind of disasters take place, and we find ourselves in situations which are very unbearable to us. And I think one other thing is that environmental justice is something that is being tackled on at the local level and at international levels. And this is done differently. It takes different shapes, it takes different forms, and there's also different strategies that are being taken up by people. And there's also a movement that we always talk about that we say it's a climate justice movement. And this is a movement that, this is a movement of many other movements, and it's taking different forms on every day. And we find that people at local level, each of them are acting in their own way to achieve the vision of having an environmental justice or a climate just society or world. And these struggles are being taken locally, and they connect to other local struggles and in different continents. We have examples of those kind of struggles that are being taken, and moreover the struggles are around energy justice, are around energy democracy, and those struggles are tackling or are challenging the way electricity is generated. For example, in South Africa, it's around electricity generation or coal electricity generation, and we also have communities challenging oil drilling. We have communities challenging gas, shale gas fracking. We have communities challenging the construction of nuclear reactors and also uranium mining. And we do have this movement in South Africa. What I'm saying is because I've been very troubled in the past days and in the past months when I've seen some of us also in this room saying we do not have a climate justice movement in South Africa. And that has been very worrying. And for the mere fact that there's been work that has been done, and Vanessa joined or was part of EarthLife from its inception. So these are the people who spearheaded the environmental justice or the climate justice movement in the country. And as early as around 2000, EarthLife was talking about a just transition to a low carbon development. So that means that there has been a movement, but that movement has taken different shapes and forms. And this movement that we have in South Africa, it's rooted in the protection of human rights, because climate justice is also about human rights. We have constitutional rights enshrined in our constitution, for example, that of access to water, clean air, food security, and that we need to live in an environment that is not harmful to our being. And the kind of movement that we have in the country, it's kind of multi-pronged. We take issues that are being taken at different ways, from the local to the national, when people on the ground would challenge the opening of coal mines, would challenge the opening of uranium mines, or whatever it's there, trying to monitor and ensure that that does not become very harmful to their being. This movement in the country is the movement that has been challenging oil drilling, and we know of the South Devon struggles. This movement is a movement that has been challenging shale gas fracking. This movement is a movement that has been also challenging coal expansion in the country. The movement that challenged the World Bank loan to Medupi. This is the movement that had actually raised issues around why we don't take part in decision-making processes in this country as to whether what sort of energy would we want or electricity generation do we want. But then the question comes up, and I think this is the question that for the mere fact that people have been saying there's no movement in South Africa, I'm not sure whether this has got to erase all the struggles that people have taken. This has got to erase that people have actually paid with their lives for taking up these issues to protect their human rights and to ensure that justice prevails. So I got very worried when I got there to say there's no movement in South Africa, while I know that there's a lot of people who actually have laid their life bare to ensure that justice prevails in the country. And maybe the question that we ask ourselves is that, is this because this is not branded? We ask ourselves if maybe this is not branded because there's this issue that every time there's a movement, there's people coming together, there's some sort of a label that people have got to be part of or to be given. And that is something that is a little bit worrisome, because this is all about human rights. But in South Africa, we have to acknowledge that environmental movement in South Africa is still wrought with class, race, and gender politics. And we have to be open and accept that and find a way on how to correct that. When EarthLife started around 1988, and when the Environmental Justice Network Forum started, these were the issues that the Environmental Justice Network Forum was trying to address. The issues of class, the issues of race, the issues of gender within the protection of human rights. And these are some of the issues that we really need to talk about, to be open about, and not say there is no environmental justice movement because it's not branded, or the people who are on the cold face of injustices on the ground do not have a particular color or are not of a particular class. And another thing is that what is also important is strategies that are being used. The strategies that are being used, they may not be strategies that other people would feel comfortable with, but we understand that we all have a complementary role, and that complementary role would be of those people who will be on the ground, who will speak popular language, who will talk to the people in their own way and understand and respect that the people, indigenous knowledge systems would be the strategies that they would use to challenge any injustice that is around them. But then the other question is, do we have to really copy what the northern countries' strategies and movements are built around? I think we are African and we need to accept that, and maybe what we need to have is to have some sort of form of a mixture. Yes, we do have a form of a mixture on the strategies that we use, like we have mass mobilization, we challenge what's happening on the ground in our own areas. For example, when people in the coal mining areas challenge the coal mines, they don't really come and say, we don't want a coal mine because the greenhouse gas emissions that would come here or the amount of water that would be used for the mine is going to be this much. People would use their own stories to say, this is our heritage site, this is where we plant our crops, this is where we come for refuge, or this is where we would rather as a community come and have our own traditional ceremonies. They don't talk about all those kind of things, and that is one thing that we need to respect, that the indigenous knowledge systems, people's cultures and heritage are very important, rather than us wanting to bring in what comes to the north and say this is a one-size-fits-all. It cannot be a one-size-fits-all, especially when you feel the pain yourself in where you are and the injustice inflicted on you. But I think one of the things that we need to do is, as a movement, like I'm saying, I insist that we have a movement, although wrought in different, although having different forms and also having its own challenges, is that we need to respect every form of challenging the injustice that we have. If people are saying we don't want this coal mine, this is our reasons for that. If people are saying we don't want this coal-fired power station and this is the strategy that we're going to employ, we need to respect that and not really take it that this is not the right strategy and not support. I think solidarity and supporting struggles on the ground is the way to go. We cannot afford not to support each other and be in solidarity with each other, even though you are not there practically at that particular place, but employ other ways of amplifying those struggles on the ground. The other thing that we need to continuously do to hold our governments accountable. Our governments have made, for example, South Africa has made a lot of international commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. They have strategies for adaptation, strategies for mitigation, and they also are saying there's finance towards particular stuff. But then if we don't hold them accountable to say walk your talk, our movements would not really be that effective, or even if they are effective, but governance plays an important role, and it's up to us to make sure that we hold governments accountable so that right can be done on the ground. The other way forward that I think is important is to continuously call on the financing institutions to divest from fossil fuels. And that is very powerful. We've seen in the past days from the UN Secretary General's Assembly that there's a lot more of the finance institutions that have signed the Law 14 agreement to say we are going to divest from financing fossil fuel projects, particularly coal. And one of our duty is to continuously disrupt business as usual of electricity generation by coal. If we don't disrupt that, we're not going to save the planet or save ourselves. But I think what is important and a challenge to us is to ensure that we become part of the just transition to a low carbon development, because that's our future. Thank you.
Thanks, Makoma. Vanessa, welcome. I'm going to try to fix this. Harder than it looks. It's better with the thing, right? You can hear better.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm talking about our contribution around the climate justice struggle from the lens of agroecology, which is where BioWatch works. And I'm going to start off by saying that agroecology is best practice, and not go into too much detail around it, but it's basically farming with nature. So trying to attain food sovereignty, which is control over our seed, our land, our resources for production, and put that in the hands of the people on the ground to achieve food sovereignty, and doing that by working with nature. So having said that, and the reason I've said that is that I think in the climate justice struggle for a long time, the food system has been a sort of invisible component. So we've spoken a lot about development and energy and components of things, but for a long time people didn't really talk about the food system, which is at the heart of the climate change issue. And I think we need to take that up more, that it also, in taking that up, we can link to all these other struggles in the movement, because the food system intersects with all of them. And I'm going to pick out some of them that are topical at the moment that I think we can talk to and link up our struggles with. So why I say that the food system is central to climate change is that if you look at the whole global food system and the different components of it, and add up the emissions from each component that contributes to the food system, it's anything between 30 and 50%, depending on who's doing the calculating. And for a long time, the IPCC didn't look at the food system as a whole. They just looked at on-farm or in-production emissions. And the organization called GRAIN, not connected to GRAIN South Africa, an NGO, did research into each component and came up with these kinds of figures. So there's on-farm, but there's also all the emissions related to land use change for agriculture, the transport involved, processing, packaging, freezing and retail, and then waste. And we know that 1/3 of food in the food system is wasted, and a lot of it goes into landfill where it generates emissions. So this year, IPCC's finally looked at it, and they've put it at around about 1/3 of climate emissions from the food system. So it's starting to be recognized as a central driver for climate change, and also something that's going to be radically affected by climate change. And I think we all know this, that in South Africa, our food system is hugely at risk. Most of our food, our staple growing areas, won't be able to grow the staples like maize that people are used to eating, and we need to change what we grow and how we grow. So it's about getting drier and hotter, radically hotter. Like for example in Durban, 3 degrees to 4 degrees hotter by 2100. But it's also about very erratic weather events. So we had the floods in Durban, but we also had cyclone Adai, and people who've been working on localized food systems and food securing their food, local food systems, and had that wiped out overnight in Zimbabwe. So, and Mozambique, of course, and yeah, it's just that we work with partners in Zimbabwe who were personally affected by it. So one of the questions we ask and I think we need to, so I want to go through some of the questions I think we could ask about the food system and in our struggle for climate justice, is what, first of all, is government doing and what policy do we have? And for us at BioWatch, it's very distressing because government policy seems to be hell-bent on industrialization on every level, and including the food system. So it's the policy still talking about getting small growers to scale up into an industrial food value chain, key commodity crops, how they can go into that system, which we know is completely controlled by the corporate sector, and which renders food that is nutritionally poor and most people can't afford. And as so just on that issue, that I think one of the issues around that is convincing people in power to understand that food production isn't the issue. And there's a myth that's been created by the corporate sector that's pervasive. It goes through our agricultural colleges and through our decision makers saying that we have to increase production for a growing population. And I wanted to put these stats up, looking at the production in South Africa, and I don't know if you can see from the back, but there's like a dark green line, comparing with some of the highly industrialized countries like the US, which has got the highest production, and then countries like Brazil, China, and I've got another graphic of it, just showing it in a more graphic form. So the dark green parts on the map are all the countries that produce over 3,000 kilocalories a day. And 3,000 kilocalories is the uppermost amount per person that an active male would need to have a healthy, active life. So the question is, if South Africa is producing over 3,000 kilocalories, up on the par with the US and Latin America, and I want you to look at these because these are the big grain producers who produce grain using GMO systems for feeding animals around, especially in the north, then why do we have this situation then where a quarter of South Africans are hungry, another quarter don't know where their next meal is coming from, and as a result a quarter of children are stunted, and we have huge food-related diseases. So we have a growing rise in diabetes, scary figures around, just in KZN, 6 amputations a day in the health system. 1.3 million people in KZN alone struggling with diabetes because of poor diet. And then the flip side of it, obesity, which is a growing problem, epidemic, and food insecure, particularly in urban areas. So at least a third of South Africans are obese. So we've had social grants that have improved access to food because you can buy more, but it's not dealing with the issue of undernutrition, which is a result of this terrible food system we have delivering processed foods, energy and oil, commodity crops. The other issue around the food system is just the health issues related to the pesticides and herbicides that are used in the system to produce more food. And I put this up just because it's really topical. Finally, people are questioning glyphosate, which is the main herbicide used on our crops, and it's used in conjunction with GMOs. So GMOs are created to withstand glyphosate spraying, so it's the more GMOs we have, the more glyphosate we have sprayed. And court cases now in the US where people are going to court around the cancer that's been caused by glyphosate. And that was following on from a World Health Organization reclassification of glyphosate as a cancer-causing chemical. And interestingly, even our own Cancer Association in South Africa did its own investigation of glyphosate and came to the same conclusion and wrote to the government and said, government needs to look at our glyphosate use, but it fell on deaf ears. And that's just one of these highly hazardous chemicals that are in our food system, creating this increased production. Other issues, the land issue, I think it's high on the agenda at the moment, and we know this incredibly skewed picture where 80% of South African land goes to agriculture, though a lot of it's grazing. But the majority of farmers, subsistence farmers, only have access to 14%. So we're talking about land redistribution, but we're not talking enough, I think, about what we're going to do with land when it's distributed and how we're redistributing and what we mean about it. Also that our land is increasingly becoming degraded because of this agricultural system, fertilizer and sprays. And I haven't mentioned the consequences to water, which you mentioned also, like the sort of dead zones in our oceans as a result of chemical off-washing into the ocean. And then for me, land and water are twin aspects. So we can get land rights, but what about water rights? And 60% of our fresh water is used in agricultural irrigation, where we pollute it with a whole lot of chemicals that kill our rivers and kill our oceans. And when we look at, for example, climate change policy, there's not enough discussion around what are we doing about water. Like, it's a scarce commodity, and should we be prioritizing who gets it, and should we be prioritizing human consumption over agriculture? So again, our government's continuing to promote things like timber and sugar, which consume huge amounts of water, and they're calling that agricultural development. And these trees are using more water than our basic water allocation as people. Also looking at the farmers, what kinds of farmers do we have? And there's a huge group of farmers that have been neglected in the country through policy, get very little assistance, very little access to resources, who we should be looking to support. And often, I would say that we need to look at agriculture differently, is because smallholder production is put down. And actually what's happening is smallholders actually produce most of the food in the world. And if you look at smallholder production systems, they're on average at least 1.5 times more productive than big industrial monocultures. So I think we've got to think creatively, we've got to learn from other countries, and we should learn more from countries like Cuba, who had a forced peak oil, and how did they address that. And part of that was land redistribution to much smaller units, capping the size of land that producers could have. And I think those big agricultural organizations in our country really push against that and make us think that if we do away with that, our food system is going to collapse. But if you look at land sizes of producers internationally, 94% are under 5 hectares. So it's only the big grain producers who are producing those huge monocultures that are having big land sizes, where they are expanding and expanding as they get more corporatized and consolidate. So for us, it's not about scaling up, it's about scaling out, and that's really a crucial issue. With the system, huge impact on biodiversity. So a lot of reports have been coming out this year about biodiversity loss, and particularly in the insects populations, which we also never think about, but insect collapse is critical because it cascades up through the food chain, and also insects are vital for our food system, for pollination, predation of pests, etc. So there's that, and then there's also the whole issue of agricultural biodiversity, which also is not on the agenda. Crop species being lost, animal breeds being lost, and we don't discuss it. We don't think about agricultural diversity when we talk about conservation of biodiversity. So what can we do? How can we improve that? And so seed is central for us, and it's a connecting struggle. And seed, it's influenced by the agricultural system, but it also creates the agricultural system. So if you have the indigenous varieties, the traditional varieties, they work in a polycultural production system where you can work with nature. If you have an industrial seed, the industrial seed is designed to go with industrial inputs. So it won't grow without that whole system supporting it. It won't grow without the pesticide, without the herbicide, without the irrigation, mechanization, all of those things, and the fertilizer. And then that system is highly, highly concentrated by and controlled by corporations, and this is just what's happened in the seed sector in South Africa. 2 big multinationals who own 90% of the main commodity crops, and then there's been these corporate buyovers, so now Monsanto is owned by Bayer, etc. So it's really just 4 big companies that own the food system in the industrial sector. And that follows right through our retail system and our food system, and every part of it. There's a few multinationals or corporates, big corporates that own it. And this is all information from ACB, so you can talk to Lindsay more about this. And we know what happens, so the Poloni saga and what that food system delivers to us. So we need to challenge that, and there's different ways to challenge this. And this is quite an interesting research report by a think tank called IPES that looked at some of the lock-ins to changing the food system. There's a whole report that goes behind this graphic, and at the center of it, they say concentration of power in the food system is the key challenge, and I think that's common to all our struggles, whether it's in the energy sector or what have you. So we need to think about how to break that and how to localize. So localizing for me is like a key part of the struggle, how we localize our markets, our solidarity economy that COPEX put a lot of work into. looking at what's there and supporting it. And for me, that's a really key site of struggle, and it's a very fraught one. So I know this topic was internationalism, but I think we can achieve that internationalism through supporting local struggles, but it's so fragile, because as we've seen in Brazil, as we've seen in the struggles here, whether it's the fisher folk in South Durban who've had the space taken over by corporate fishing, or the struggles around the mines in Kele, etc. It's very fragile and very hard to support. And also fear is a big driver in that. So we need to work out how we can overcome the fear that's now using localization in a conservative way and dismantling what gains we've had at local level. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa and Vishwas. It's horrible being chair when you have to stop interesting talks. Why do you guys like this? Did it just fall on its own? Oh, it fell on its own. Sorry. It's me. I was wondering if there was some other thing wrong with it. Okay. Ish. Thanks.
Really glad all of you are here, but I'm particularly glad that Vanessa is here, because Vanessa, I intersected with her in the late Comrade Muna in the Greenhouse Project, actually, in the 90s. And she was also at our party when we launched COPAC downtown Johannesburg. We had an office and we had 18 people working for COPAC, but it underlines the close relationship between environmental justice and social justice that has been at the core of COPAC's work for me. If you are a left activist in the South African context and globally, if you do not have an ecological justice grounding, then wrap it up. Okay? Wrap it up. It's got to be central to our identity and who we are as we go forward. Now, we all know that we are running out of time. There are critical tipping points, canaries in the mine, and as the planet heats, we can see that these tipping points between 1 and 3 degrees Celsius are really kicking in. So what's happening in the Arctic, the Greenland, the West Antarctic, etc. And the IPCC science is very, very important for how we think about this problem. So yes, we do have about 11 years now to prevent a 1.5 degrees Celsius overshoot. Dramatic things have to happen. We know that it's not just the climate science, but it's what's happening in everyday life now. The shocks are registering in all the weather extremes, again validated by the science and so on. We know about our own drought, and it's not over. Our government has had a pathetic response to this drought, basically. Okay. But, you know, what we learn from history is that there have been fluctuations in our climate, but we've had this 10 to 11,000 year window of a relatively stable climate. And the last ice age basically fed into major transitions that happened in planet Earth, including the transition beyond feudalism. The question is, what kind of transition and what kind of transformation do we want now in the context of this moment of climate heating and planetary heating? And can we shape that transition? What are the modalities of that transition? So we know, we have the science, we know what's happening, we know what causes this problem. It's an ecocidal capitalist system. It's destroying the planetary conditions that sustain life. But what do we do? What is the role of our agency to shape this? And we can intervene and shape this. So we've had cycles of resistance. And I would argue a long period of resistance going back 500 years with the first colonial encounter. But we've also had more recent cycles of resistance. Whether it is the struggles for life around the Zapatistas, whether it's the Cochabamba water wars, etc. We've had these cycles of resistance. Whether it's women in the Niger Delta pushing back against Shell, whether it is the Dagota access pipeline struggle in the United States. These have been very, very important struggles. And climate justice forces have been central in these national struggles, but also in the kind of COP-based struggles that emerged over the past few decades. But the high point of these struggles really was the Cochabamba People's Summit, and since then, it's been a decline. And we are now entering a new cycle of resistance with new movements, what I call 1.1 degree Celsius movements. These are movements like Sunrise Movement, Extinction Rebellion, Greta and the Children's Friday for Futures movement, and so on. These are movements that bring a certain symbolic politics to the fore, which is important, but they also have some limits. And governments that have been failing us for over 20 years are absorbing some of these demands. So they're declaring emergencies, etc. But it's also part of normalizing this crisis and how politics should happen around this crisis. So there's certain things we need to think about here. And here I want to echo a bit of what Makoma was saying. Particular strategies have been used in the global north. It doesn't mean we must just transplant them into the global south. It's very, very important for us to think about that. At the same time, the critical issue is how do we find convergences between climate justice forces that have been there in the struggle and these new movements that are emerging. Now, we demonstrated some of that on September 20th, at least in the South African context, and I'm sure it happened in other parts of the world. The 4 million that took to the streets, it wasn't just the children, and yes, they were leading, and yes, they were rising, and yes, we must support them. Absolutely. But I think it was a convergence of forces, and this is where I want to echo what Vanessa was also saying. We need to connect struggles. This is very, very important. So we have a population of about 55 million people in this country. We never had even 1 million people on the streets, given what's at stake, given how serious this crisis is. Now that's the scale question, and we have to confront that question. Okay. So where to for climate justice in South Africa? And here I want to reflect on what we've been doing in the food sovereignty space, in the climate justice charter process. What kind of movement of resistance and transformation should we conceive of to drive and lead deep socio-ecological change? Because without a movement, absent of a movement, this is going to be a process shaped by capital. It's going to be a process shaped by a state that's largely dysfunctional, and it's going to come short. So we do need people's power driving this process. But the second thing is, how should we conceive of the state? This is a very, very important issue. We cannot surrender the state to the dominant forces. So yes, in the conversations we've been having and trying to clarify, I would argue that symbolic disruption that the children that are bringing to the fore is very, very important. Greta Thunberg's metaphor of the house is on fire is a very powerful metaphor. But it's also grounded in science. And it's something that we really have to bring to the fore. Mass disruption of carbon capital on all fronts is very, very important. Mass disruption through exiting the existing logic of capital is very important. This is where agroecology is important. This is where food sovereignty is important. Solidarity economy, zero waste, building from below, exiting the system. These are very, very important forms of disruption. We also need to be shifting discourse. Over 57% of our population really don't have a clue about the climate crisis. It's a serious issue. In rural communities, it's even worse. Okay. 17% of our population are climate literate. They understand the science of climate change. So we've got to shift discourses in a way that connects with the needs of people. We can't be an abstract intervention just on the science. And that's why for us, food has been a very important issue. We also need to network convergence. And Makoma's right, people have been fighting in different ways, at local levels, etc., etc. But we do have to make that leap. We do need to find intersections. We need to aggregate. It's very, very important. And now is the moment to aggregate. We can't be stuck in our little struggles, isolated from a larger process and project. So symbolic disruption is here in South Africa as well. So yes, what happened on September 20th, what happened here at Wits, with this wall painted, kind of intervening in the discourse. Young activists like Courtney and others have been shaping the narrative. Here's us outside SANEF and confronting SANEF and the Editors Forum around their failure as the media in this country to mainstream this issue. It was symbolic, it led to a dialogue, and it led to a climate justice partnership with SANEF. Here's disrupting through gridlock carbon. So yes, we went to Sasol on September 20th. And yes, we did do a human chain and we had our speeches, etc., etc. But it laid the basis for something more. A call that we made for May 1st next year to be about gridlock carbon, nationally and globally. And that means working closely with the unions from now till May 1st next year to gridlock Santon, to stop everything that happens in Santon, to consider gridlocking Richards Bay, to consider gridlocking other major sites of carbon extraction, use, etc., etc. The airlines being one of them, etc. We've got to take the struggle to that level. We have to, okay? And we haven't done that yet. There's also the disruption of the system that I mentioned. So we've got to find pathways. This map with these little green dots are the bottom-up pathways that we are busy with in terms of food sovereignty. So Magda is here, and she's doing amazing work in the Cape Flats, working with a school, working with a whole set of other schools, etc. There are other activists in this room, Mazibuko and Ntinga, building pathways. What we are doing at WITS is building pathways. But it's also about moving big institutions. We've got to move big institutions to disrupt the system. And that's why moving an institution like WITS, where we demanded, when we marched and put out a petition of 8,000 signatures, we want a zero waste, zero carbon, zero hunger university. And we're trying to knock this on now to other universities. So disrupting the system through exiting is a very, very crucial form of resistance. So shifting discourse and the kind of emphasis we are putting into all of this around strategic convergence is the climate justice charter process. It comes out of our 5 years campaigning around food sovereignty, which coincided with the drought, and so we realized we had to make these connections. Hunger, the drought, and climate. And that's been a lot of our work, from our drought speakouts, hunger tribunals, food sovereignty festivals, People's Act, etc. So this charter process comes out of that. And we've been dialoguing with various constituencies in the country. And we are at a point now where we've invited over 50 think pieces from leading activists, NGOs, movements, etc. to help us define the content of this charter. We've got great input from the past 5 years of engagements, from the round tables, and now it's bringing it all together in a conference in November. But it's not just about the formality of a conference and a text. It's also about providing a vision for where we want to go. Where do we want to take South Africa? And that's the strategic issue. The other issue is to bring forces together, build an alliance. Now, we haven't clarified what this means, but it is in process and we need to have these debates. We're using the COPAC conference as a moment to engage on this question. How do we bring forces together? And so the climate emergency state has been surfaced, it's been part of Extinction Rebellion's narrative, etc. But we also got to be very careful in the context in which this demand or notion is emerging. It's emerging in the context of authoritarian and neo-fascist shifts in the world. You don't want these forces to declare a state of exception because they will use the state against the people in authoritarian ways. We also got to be careful about this discourse handing over the struggle to the state. So hence, we need to have a recognition of the climate emergency. That's very, very important. But we need to be demanding a climate justice state that commits to deepening democracy, supporting systemic transformation, not leading it, enhancing climate disaster capacity, democratic planning is very, very important for where we need to go. So we need to orientate with, against, and beyond the state. And we've been saying this in our work on food sovereignty and solidarity economy. So there are various challenges as we go down this path. The state has an agenda on climate politics, but it's what we've seen over 26 years of ANC rule. It's about invited spaces. It's about dividing forces. It's about co-option. It's about neutralizing the potential for mass power. We must not let that happen. Barbara Creasy is not our friend. She's in a state that is driving an agenda of carbon capitalism, and we must fight. Liberals amongst us must think about this question very, very seriously. We must also reach publics. We must reach our public because there is a knowledge deficit, and the politics we do must reach deep into society. Finally, we must also be building transformative activist capacity. So these three forms of disruption require a large-scale effort of education, And there are lots of organizations in this room that are doing amazing work at the grassroots. We've got to scale that up. Mazibuko is now deputy of Chisimani. How do we work with the Chisimani Activist School in Cape Town and others in this room to build this network and this capacity to scale things up? Alliance building. So, you know, turfs and territories and protecting those things and having some claims on certain things. The climate struggle is bigger than all of us. It's bigger than every person on this planet and government, okay? So the climate issue is a great leveler. It's a humbling thing, okay? So we have to think about how we work together, how we build a climate justice bloc. How do we bring it together around convergence in struggle and network? Very, very important. So the other question that will emerge as we go down this path is how do we think about local and national government elections? Now, I don't have the answer to this question, but our parties are useless in South Africa. That's the bottom line. They don't care.
Absolutely.
Okay? They steal, they loot, they're all about themselves. They're self-serving political parties. It's a debate we need to have on the left. Amandla.
Amandla.
Great, wonderful. Thank you to all the speakers. Can we now